My name is Grace Whitman. I'm 30 years old, and for 5 years, my own mother introduced me to the world as a waitress. Not an electrician. Not the owner of a company with 28 employees and a fleet of work vans rolling through 3 counties. A waitress, always said with a little sigh, a little sadness in her voice, like she was talking about a daughter who'd gotten sick and never quite recovered. And after her second glass of Chardonnay at family gatherings, the sigh would turn into something sharper. The family disappointment. That was my role. I'd been cast in it at 28 years old, and nobody had bothered to check if I wanted the part. It was a Thursday morning in September when the invitation showed up on my workbench in Columbus. Right between a torque wrench and a stack of hospital wiring schematics I'd been squinting at since 6 a.m. Cream-colored envelope, gold script lettering. It smelled, faintly, unmistakably, of her perfume, the same bottle she'd worn since I was a kid, sweet and powdery, the smell of Sunday mornings and disapproval. Eleanor Whitman's 60th birthday, October 14th. The whole family is expected. 50 guests. One rented hall, and a version of me that existed nowhere except inside my mother's head. I want you to understand something before we go any further, because it's the hinge this whole story swings on. What my mother said to me in front of those 50 guests, and what I handed her 30 seconds later, ended a lie that had been running for 13 years. But underneath that lie was something even bigger, something none of us saw coming. 3 days after that party, my mother was set to lose everything she owned, the house, the garage, the only thing left of my father. And I was the one person on this earth who could stop it from happening. I let that invitation sit on my workbench for a full week before I even touched it. I ran an electrical contracting company on the east side of Columbus, 28 employees, 12 vans, $3.4 million in contracts the year before. I was elbow-deep in a bid for a hospital wing addition, red pen in my teeth, when my phone lit up with a name I hadn't seen in a while, Aunt Diane. Diane is my mother's older sister, and the only person in my family who calls me at work like I actually have a job worth interrupting. Gracie, she said, the second I picked up, tell me you got the invitation. I told her I got it. She let a silence sit there the way she always does, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that's doing work. Your mother's turning 60, she finally said. Whatever this is between you two, bury it for one night, one dinner. You can go back to hating each other by Sunday. I don't hate my mother, I told her, and that was true. It was also the single most complicated sentence I own. Then come early, Diane said, moving right past it. The hall's floodlights are shot, and the rental company wants $400 just to look at them. You're handy. Handy? I sat there in my office chair, staring at a bid worth $2 million. And my own aunt used the word handy like I was somebody's nephew with a toolbox in his trunk. That word had followed me around my whole adult life. I bid jobs that build hospital wings and rewire elementary schools, and to my own family, I am handy. I said yes anyway, and I noticed, as I hung up, that my hand had gone tight around the phone, white-knuckled. I hadn't even realized I was gripping it that hard. Here's the detail that ate at me for the next 3 days, the one I couldn't stop turning over in my head on the drive home that night. The invitation had come from Diane. She addressed it. She licked the stamp. She mailed it. My mother, my actual mother, the birthday girl, had never once asked for me to be there. As far as I knew, my mother was perfectly content with the story she'd been telling everyone since I was 28. That her daughter waited tables somewhere in the city. That it was a shame, really, how some kids just don't turn out the way you hope. I loaded my tools into my truck that Thursday and drove 90 minutes back toward Millbrook. Back toward the woman who had invented me out of thin air and handed the invention to everyone we knew. To understand what happened at that party, you need to go back further, back to a garage that always smelled like copper wire and burnt coffee. My father, Walter Whitman, was an electrician. One man, one white van with blue lettering that read, Whitman Electric. He had a reputation across 3 counties for never cutting a corner. Not once. Not even on the jobs where nobody would have noticed if he had. I was 12 years old, the first time he let me wire a practice panel he'd mounted on a sheet of plywood. He stood behind me with his arms crossed, watching me strip 14-gauge wire with hands that were still too small for the strippers I was using. Slow is smooth, he'd say, low and even. Smooth is fast. Saturdays in that garage were the best education I ever received, and I include 4 years of a formal engineering program in that comparison. My father taught me that electricity is honest. It does exactly, precisely, what the person who installed it deserves. No more mercy than that, no less. He taught me to respect load, to label everything, to never, ever trust a wire I hadn't tested myself, no matter who told me it was safe. And once, I must have been 14, I asked him why he never put his name on a bigger sign. Something with lights on it, something a person could see from the highway. He wiped his hands on a rag hanging from his belt loop and said the sentence I have carried with me every single day since. Load-bearing walls don't ask to be noticed, Grace. Then he winked at me and went back to work like he hadn't just handed his 12-year-old daughter a religion to spend the rest of her life inside of. My mother watched all of this from the porch. Every Saturday, for years. She'd bring out a pitcher of lemonade, set it down on the top step, and go back inside without a word. In all those years of Saturdays, she never once came into that garage. Not once. She loved my father. I want to be fair about that, because it's true, but she loved him in a pressed shirt, church pew kind of way, and the garage embarrassed her. For years, I thought it was the grease, the stains on his knuckles that never quite came out. It took me 20 more years to understand it was the calluses, not the dirt, the evidence. I should have understood it standing right there on that porch line between the two of them. It would have saved me a full decade of my life. My dad died on a Tuesday in March, 10 years ago, kneeling in front of a breaker panel at the county fairgrounds. His heart simply gave out. He was 51 years old. He'd been feeling tired for months and treating it with black coffee. Because men like my father don't take mornings off. Not for anything. Not even for the thing that eventually kills them. I was 19. A sophomore in electrical engineering at Ohio State. The first Whitman ever to make it that far into a college classroom. And then the paperwork started. And paperwork tells the truth the way paperwork always does, whether you want to hear it or not. His life insurance policy was small. The van had a lien against it nobody had mentioned. The house on Maple Street had a second mortgage I'd never once heard whispered about at the dinner table, and the checking account held less money than what was sitting in my college meal plan. Somebody had to work. My brother Marcus was 22 and buried in pharmacy school, the family's official investment, the one whose diploma was already being measured for a frame. So one night, I sat at our kitchen table with a legal pad and did the math out loud. Tuition on one side, groceries and mortgage payments on the other, waiting, actually waiting, foolishly hoping for my mother to fight me on it, to say, finish the semester, we'll find a way, your father would want it. She didn't say that. She looked at the legal pad for a long, long moment. And then she said, just don't tell anyone at church yet. Not, don't do it. Not, let's find another way. Don't tell anyone. I remember the refrigerator humming behind us. I remember thinking, genuinely thinking, that I must have misheard her, that grief scrambles people's words, that this wasn't really what she meant. I withdrew from Ohio State that Friday, and the thing I know now, the thing I refused to let myself know back then, is that my mother buried 2 things that March: her husband, and the version of her daughter she could brag about at coffee hour. Only one of them ever got a headstone. For the next few years, I waited tables at a steakhouse off the interstate. And I want to be clear about something, because this detail matters more than it might sound like it does. It was good. Hard, honest work, and the tip money kept the lights on at 214 Maple Street. My mother told people I was figuring things out. What I was actually figuring out was an application to the Electricians Union apprenticeship program, which I filled out on a break room table during double shifts, using a pen I'd stolen from a customer's table because mine had run dry. 5 years of paid training. At 20 years old, I got in. One of two women in a class of 50. I drove to Millbrook on a Sunday to tell my mother over pot roast, because I genuinely believed, God help me, that she was going to be proud of me. She set down her fork. She looked at me the way you look at a stain on good carpet, the kind you already know isn't coming out. An electrician, she said, testing the word out loud, like it tasted bad. Yes, I told her. Exactly like Dad. And my mother, with the pot roast steaming between us, with Marcus's framed pharmacy acceptance letter already hanging gold and centered on the living room wall behind her, smoothed the tablecloth flat with both hands and said, "In this family, we hang diplomas, not aprons." Marcus studied his plate like it owed him money. Nobody said another word for the rest of the meal. That single sentence had an entire cosmology folded inside it, and I would spend the next decade of my life learning its rules whether I wanted to or not. Rule 1. It is better to look successful than to actually be solvent. Rule 2. A daughter's job is to be presentable. Rule 3. There is a kind of work this family climbs on top of, and a kind of work this family climbs away from as fast as it can, and my father and I had always been the second kind. Within a year, I heard through a cousin that my mother was telling the aunts I was still waitressing, still, like it was a chronic condition, like something you catch and never fully recover from. People always ask me the same question when I tell this story. Why didn't I just correct her? Just tell everyone the truth. I did, twice. Learn from my mistakes here, because I paid full price for both lessons. The first time, the year my company was born, I mailed my mother a brochure. Glossy paper, our fleet of vans lined up in a neat row, my name printed clean at the bottom. Grace Whitman, owner. I genuinely believed paper would work on her, since paper was the only currency she ever fully respected. It came back to me 9 days later, unopened. The envelope hadn't even been slit. She'd written a single line on a sticky note in her looping church bulletin cursive. Please stop confusing your aunts. That was the entire response. 9 words, and not one of them mine. The second time was at my Uncle Peter's funeral, 2 years after that. Aunt Diane's husband, a genuinely good man, who once lent my father his truck for a month and never once brought it up again. At the reception, my cousin Karen asked, loudly and kindly, whether I was still working at the restaurant. I was tired. Grief has a way of stripping the diplomacy right off you, so I told the truth. I own an electrical company, I said. 22 employees, at the time. We just wired the new elementary school over in Grove City. And my mother materialized out of the casserole line, tears already standing bright in her eyes, and said, "Grace, honey, please. Not today of all days." Then, softer, turned toward Karen. She embellishes. It's been hard on her since her father. She dabbed at her eyes with a folded napkin, and every single face in that room turned toward me. The daughter making a scene at a funeral, upsetting a widow who had already buried one husband and was now watching her sister bury one too. You cannot fact-check a crying mother. There is no paperwork for that kind of accusation. Whatever I said next was only going to prove her story right in front of a room full of witnesses. So I said nothing, and the silence authorized every word she'd said. So I stopped correcting the record entirely. I built things instead, quietly. That was my first real mistake. And it would take another 5 years for the bill to come due. Here's what 9 years of quiet looks like, laid out flat. Journeyman electrician's card at 24, master electrician's license at 28, the same year. I signed a lease on a garage bay with 2 used vans and a coffee maker that only worked if you threatened it with violence. I named the company Whitman and Daughter Electric. People hear that name and assume it runs father to child, some proud old man handing his business down to a grateful successor. I let them assume it every time, because correcting them wasn't worth the breath. The truth runs the other direction entirely. My father's company died with him, kneeling in front of that breaker panel. Naming mine after him was how I dragged what was left of it back out of the ground. His name rides on every door of every van, painted in the exact same blue his van used to wear. By last year, we were 28 people strong, with $3.4 million in active contracts, schools, medical clinics, a hospital wing, and one job I never once told my mother about, because God apparently has a sense of humor. And so, it turns out, does the municipal bidding process. 14 months ago, the First Methodist Church of Millbrook, my mother's own church, the same pews she has polished her reputation on for 40 straight years, caught fire from 60-year-old aluminum wiring in the fellowship hall. Nobody was hurt. The rebuild committee took competitive bids for the electrical work. My estimator flagged it as a solid, low-risk municipal adjacent job, and we won it clean. I stayed off the job site personally, sent my best crews, kept my name on all the paperwork as G.I. Whitman, which everyone in that town automatically reads as a man's initial. Whitman is half the phone book in that county anyway, and in my mother's cosmology, her daughter carried trays for a living. The thought of me winning a church contract simply never crossed her mind as a possibility. My mother sat on that rebuild committee. For 3 straight months, she walked right past my vans, past my crews, past my father's name in blue letters, and never once saw a thing that mattered. Diane told me afterward that Mom actually bragged about the crew to her book club. Such a professional outfit, she'd said. She had no idea she was complimenting her own disappointment. By this past fall, I had exactly one dream left, with a price tag attached to it. The old Harwell building on Parsons Avenue, brick, built in the 1920s. 11,000 square feet of dead department store, just sitting there waiting for somebody to see what I saw in it. I wanted to fill it with training benches. A trade school. The Whitman and Daughter Training School, teaching kids exactly like me, the broke ones, the dropouts, the ones nobody ever bothers to frame a picture of, how to bend conduit and read a panel schedule and build an entire life out of their own 2 hands. I had $158,000 saved for the down payment, 5 years of skipped vacations, sitting untouched in an account I refused to look at except to add to it. The seller wanted to close by the end of October. My letter of intent was already drafted. My father's name was finally going up on a wall too big to ever mail back to me unopened. That was supposed to be my October, and sitting right in the middle of it, like a breaker I didn't particularly want to touch, was my mother's 60th birthday party. 5 years of being the family disappointment teaches you the entire choreography. The kids' table at Thanksgiving, at 31 years old, cousins asking if I was still waitressing while their husbands casually asked me, with zero self-awareness, to take a look at their flickering hallway light while I was there. I could have skipped that party. I'd skipped things before, and the sky had stayed exactly where it was. But Diane had asked, and Diane never asks for anything twice. And some stubborn, bone-deep Whitman gene inside me wanted to stand in that hall one last time before my real life finally started somewhere else. One night, I told myself, driving west on I-70 with my tools rattling in the bed of my truck. One night, and then the Harwell closing, and then finally a life with my own name on it. The universe heard that thought and, I am fairly sure, smiled to itself. Because what I actually found in Millbrook that week wasn't a party. It was a house fire, the slow kind. The kind that takes years to reach the ceiling, and everyone I loved was still standing inside it. I got to Millbrook 2.5 weeks ahead of the party, because Diane's chore list had a habit of multiplying overnight. I checked into the Hillside Motel, because staying at my mother's house had stopped being an option years ago, and both of us had long since agreed, silently, to pretend that was completely normal. Thursday afternoon, I drove past 214 Maple Street slowly, the way you read an old report card you're not proud of. From the curb, the house looked perfect. Hedges squared off with a level, practically. Porch swept clean. The lawn edged so precisely it looked like it had been drawn with a ruler. A lawn service does that kind of work, and lawn services cost real money. But I grew up in that house, and I read houses for a living. The paint on the south side, behind the gutters where the street couldn't see it, was peeling in long sheets. One downspout had rusted clean through, and somebody had propped a paver stone under it to angle the water away from the foundation. A 50-cent fix wearing the mask of a $5,000 problem. The garage roof had a tarp corner poking out from under the shingles, tucked back where nobody driving by would notice. A house with a perfect face and a rotting Bacchus. A house performing for somebody Friday morning. I went off rental hole, took at the floodlights. Diane had a Skedem Tofix, and that told me even more than the house had the floodlights themselves. Where a finitoise, the wiring feeding them, that was the problem. Somebody had run a cheap extension line through a junction box with no cover at all, kind of shortcut evenly. Take one, the real, quote, scared you off. I fixed it in under an hour with parts already in Mivan. But standing on that ladder, I kept circling back to the tarp, the downspout, the paver stone. Somebody in my mother's carefully tidy world had been cutting corners for a long time. Quietly, precisely in the places nobody ever thinks to look. And nobody alive knows better than I do what my family does with things it doesn't want seen. You have to understand what my mother built in order to understand what she was so terrified of losing. Eleanor Whitman is a widow of 14 years who turned widowhood into a full-time career. Rebuild Committee at First Methodist. Treasurer of the book club that meets every other Tuesday at Barbara Pruitt's house. And if you don't happen to know a Barbara Pruitt personally, understand that she is her town's radio station, broadcasting on every frequency, with no off switch anyone has ever located. My mother hosts the committee brunch every single spring, real tablecloths, the good china that only she is permitted to wash by hand. In Millbrook, being Eleanor Whitman means something specific, and what it means is, that woman held it together. Husband dropped dead at his job and she never missed a Sunday service, never let the hedges go wild, raised a pharmacist. The town handed her a title, the strong widow, and she has spent 14 straight years paying its dues in Capitero's appearances, and a posture that never once slipped in public. Saturday, while I helped Diane fold chairs for the party, I watched my mother hold court on the hall's front walk with Barbara and 2 other committee women, laughing with her head tipped all the way back, wearing pressed slacks on a Saturday afternoon. She saw me hauling chairs across the lot and gave me the exact nod she gives the caterer. Fine, I know my role in this production. But that evening, loading chairs into Diane's van, my aunt looked back at the hall and said something that lodged itself in me like a splinter. 60 years old, Diane muttered, half to herself. And God knows how she keeps that house running on nothing. I asked what she meant by nothing. Diane got very busy with a chair strap all of a sudden. Your father's insurance? I mean, it wasn't much. She stretches it. Diane is a genuinely terrible liar, and she knows it about herself, which is exactly why she suddenly needed to go start the van. I stood alone in that parking lot with a folding chair in each hand, doing math I did not like the shape of. My brother Marcus showed up Sunday to help set up the overflow tent, and Marcus does not do tents. He's a pharmacist in Dayton now, with 2 kids and a good lawn. The family's finished, polished product. We're not enemies, my brother and me. We're something worse than that. We're polite. He hugged me with one arm and told me I looked good. And then he spent the next 2 hours being somewhere else entirely, checking his phone the way a man checks a wound he's hoping hasn't gotten infected. Twice he walked past the hedges to take a call. Both times he came back wearing a face he'd clearly built for himself out in the driveway. I helped him tension the tent lines. Up close, he looked gray. The exact color of a man who isn't sleeping. "Work?" I asked. "Sure," he said. "Sure." The third call came through while we were coiling rope together, and he didn't manage to walk away fast enough that time. I heard it, not the words themselves, but the cadence. That flat, read-a-few-screen voice, the kind that opens with "This call may be recorded," and my brother, saying, quietly, I understand. I understand. Is there any flexibility on the date?" You hear that particular tone exactly once in your life, and you never, ever forget the shape of it afterward. I'd heard it myself at 19 years old, on our kitchen phone, negotiating with my dead father's creditors between waitressing shifts. Banks do not call pharmacists on a Sunday afternoon about prescriptions. Marcus pocketed his phone and picked the rope back up like nothing had happened. And I looked at my brother, the good one, the framed one, the family's official investment, and had a thought that landed in my chest like touching a live wire. He knows something about this family that I don't. 14 years of being the outsider had taught me exactly one useful thing. I knew precisely what my family looked like when it was hiding something. It looked busy. It looked polite. It looked exactly, precisely, like this. Monday afternoon, my mother needed her porch light fixed before the out-of-town cousins arrived. And Diane volunteered me before I had a chance to open my mouth. So there I was, alone in my childhood hallway, tracing a dead circuit back to the fuse panel. When I opened the hall console drawer looking for the spare fuses, my father always used to keep their pure muscle memory. 15 years since I'd actually lived in that house, and my hand still knew exactly which drawer to open. The fuses were there, just like always. So was a stack of mail, 4 inches tall, held together with a rubber band, shoved all the way to the back underneath a church directory. First Millbrook Savings, over and over and over. The same return address stamped in the corner of every envelope like a drumbeat that never let up. Some of them were opened. The opened ones were worse. I know I shouldn't have read them. I also know, with complete certainty, that you, sitting wherever you happen to be listening to this right now, would have read them too. Home equity line of credit, opened 8 years earlier. Original draw, $90,000. Current balance, with accrued interest, $149,000. The words past due, stamped in red ink, that does not photograph well on good china. Minimum payments made faithfully, then partial payments, then, eventually, a letter this past spring using a phrase that made my chest go cold the second I read it, maturity date. The balance was due in full. My mother had been quietly borrowing against my father's house for 8 straight years. Against the paint she wasn't buying, against the roof she was tarping instead of fixing. Borrowing, month after month, simply to keep being Eleanor Whitman, the lawn service, the committee brunches, the checks written out to the church rebuild fund, the entire good china economy of a woman propping up her kingdom on a dead man's equity. I stood in that hallway holding a fuse in one hand and the wreckage of her secret in the other, while out front, her book club laughed together about centerpieces. I walked straight out to the driveway, held up one of the envelopes, and watched my brother, aged 5 years, while standing perfectly still. "How long have you known?" I asked him, keeping my voice down. The book club was 20 feet away and one window pane thin. Marcus glanced toward the house and steered me around behind his SUV, the way we used to hide report cards from each other as kids. "Since spring," he said. "She missed the maturity date, called me in a panic, and made me swear not to tell anyone. She put me on the account as an authorized contact so I could talk to the bank on her behalf. Grace, I've been trying. I refinanced my own car. I've been sending what I could. And then it all came out of him, right there in the driveway. In the exact tone of a man rehearsing a confession he had genuinely hoped he'd never actually have to give out loud. The line of credit was 8 years old. She'd drawn it down slowly, patiently, the lawn service, the assessments, Christmas, appearances that had to be kept up. When my father's insurance money finally ran dry, the house itself simply became her salary. "There's something else," Marcus said, looking down at the gravel instead of at me. "The property taxes. The money you've been sending me every year." For 6 years, I already knew what he was about to say from the look on his face, but I made him say it anyway. "She thinks it's mine." Grace. She'd ask where the money came from, and what was I supposed to tell her? That her waitress daughter. He stopped himself. But the sentence had already finished itself just fine without his help. "She thinks it's mine." 6 years of my quiet money, and my own brother had let our mother believe he was the one holding the entire roof up over her head. "You should hate me," he said quietly. I looked at my brother and felt something worse than hatred. I felt recognition. "No," I told him. "You're just fluent in her language." There was one envelope left in that stack my mother hadn't opened. Certified mail, signature required, signed for in her own tidy cursive at the door, and then buried under a church directory, which is roughly my mother's entire filing system for reality itself. Marcus and I opened it together, sitting on the tailgate of his SUV, the way you'd approach diffusing something dangerous. It was worse than everything else combined. Notice of foreclosure sale. Legal language stacked up like cinder blocks, and right in the middle of it, a single date. Bolded: the property at 214 Maple Street would be sold at sheriff's auction on October 17th. I read it twice. Then I pulled out my phone and looked at the invitation Diane had mailed me, because I needed to physically see both dates side by side before I could let myself believe them. The party, October 14th. The auction, October 17th. My mother was going to stand in a rented hall in pressed slacks and raise a glass in front of 40 guests, under lights I had personally fixed for free, celebrating 60 years of being Eleanor Whitman, and 72 hours after that toast. The county was going to sell my father's house off the courthouse steps to the highest bidder. Marcus kept saying, "We have time. There are programs." I'll call Monday, the exact way people talk once the math has already eaten them alive from the inside. I wasn't really listening anymore. I was standing in the driveway where my father once taught me how to back a trailer, holding a date in my 2 hands. October 17th. Hold on to that date the way I did, because absolutely everything else that happens in this story happens against that clock, ticking down. That night at the motel, I laid the invitation and the foreclosure notice side by side on the bedspread and sat there a long time, listening to the interstate hum outside like a loaded neutral wire. Tuesday. I went back to finish the porch light while my mother polished silverware for a party she genuinely could not afford, and I tried, gently, carefully, to hand her a way out without letting on that I'd found the drawer. Big house for one person, I said, easy, casual, lot of upkeep. She kept polishing. A friend of mine downsized last year. I tried. Best decision she ever made. Nice condo near her grandkids, no gutters to think about ever again. I'm not moving to a condo, Grace. Nobody said condo. I said smaller. Houses get heavy sometimes. There's no shame in setting one down. I watched her spine assemble itself, vertebra by vertebra, into the exact posture she wears at church. "Do you know what this town would say," she said, "if Eleanor Whitman sold her house? They'd say she couldn't manage. They'd say Walter left her with nothing." She set the serving spoon down into its velvet slot, like she was laying it to rest in a coffin. "This family hangs diplomas, Grace, not aprons. And it does not hang for sale signs." There it was. The whole religion, delivered in one sentence, exactly the same as it had been over the pot roast 12 years earlier. Except this time, I could finally hear what it actually was underneath the words. Not cruelty, doctrine. She would rather drown, quietly, gracefully, than ever be seen swimming hard for shore. Because in her world, the being seen was the drowning. I finished the light. She held the ladder steady, and for one strange, suspended minute, we were almost a team, her hand on the aluminum. Me above her in the dusk light. You always were good with your hands, she said, and she meant it kindly. And that, somehow, was the saddest part of the entire afternoon. That night, Diane found me outside my motel room with a six-pack of ginger ale and a piece of the truth I never expected. She sat down in the plastic chair by my door and, out of nowhere, said, "You know, she was almost a nurse." I said no. Nobody had ever told me a single word of this. "Nursing school in Columbus. Class of '88, Diane said. She was top of her class after the first year. Then Marcus came along a little ahead of schedule. Diane turned the can slowly in her hands. Our mother drove up, packed Eleanor's whole dorm room into the back of the Buick, and got her a cashier job at the pharmacy back in town. Told her married girls with babies don't need diplomas. And when Eleanor cried about it, cried for a solid week. Gracie, our mother told her, a diploma is the only thing they can't take away from you. And now, she said, you'll never have one. The parking lot was quiet except for the ice machine humming somewhere behind us. She's been trying to graduate ever since, Diane said. Through Marcus, through the committees, through whatever it is she's been doing with you. I want to be careful here, because understanding something is never the same as excusing it. And I refuse to hand my mother's cruelty a doctor's note it hasn't earned. But sitting on that curb, I finally saw the wiring underneath everything. My grandmother had driven a single sentence into a 24-year-old girl like a nail into wet concrete. And the concrete had set. And 35 years later, that same girl was still standing, frozen in its exact shape. Introducing her own daughter as a waitress because a daughter with calluses proved the old sentence right, and the sentence could never, ever be allowed to be right about her own house, her own life, her own legacy. My mother wasn't the author of the story that had been quietly eating our whole family alive. She was its longest-running victim. She'd simply never once stopped charging admission to it. Back in my room, I did what Whitmans do at kitchen tables and motel desks alike. I made 2 columns on a legal pad. Left column, the Harwell Building, $158,000 saved for the down payment. Letter of intent already drafted. Closing set for the end of October. My father's name finally going up on a wall. Right column, a foreclosure notice with a balance of $149,000 and climbing. Plus legal fees, plus interest that never stopped running, not even for a single hour. The 2 numbers sat there on that pad, staring each other down like they already knew exactly how this was going to end. I called Michelle Park at 9 o'clock that night. Michelle has been my company's attorney since we were 4 vans and a prayer, and she picks up when I call because I have never once abused that privilege. I told her everything. She went quiet for a moment, and then she went to work the way genuinely good lawyers do. No drama, just doors opening one after another. Forget the auction, she said. Auctions are loud, and you can lose. If First Millbrook is holding that note 8 years past origination and 12 months delinquent, they don't actually want the house. Grace, they want it off their books, clean and quiet. So we don't buy the house, we buy the debt. We take assignment of the mortgage, we cancel the sale, and the whole thing stays inside a filing cabinet instead of on the courthouse steps in front of the whole county. Clean, legal, fast, and total. Every single dollar of the Harwell Fund gone into my mother's drowned equity. I sat there with the pen hovering over the legal pad, and my father's voice came up through 14 years of floorboards. Load-bearing walls don't ask to be noticed. Right, Dad? But you never told me the other half of that sentence. Maybe they shouldn't have to keep hiding inside the drywall either. Maybe the hiding was never humility to begin with. Maybe it was just a smaller, quieter way of being ashamed. I decided alone in room 14 of the Hillside Motel at 1 in the morning with a legal pad and a can of ginger ale gone flat beside me. The house does not get sold on the courthouse steps. Not that house. Not the garage where my father taught me that slow is smooth. Not sold off in front of Barbara Pruitt's entire radio audience while my mother's church friends drive past the sign on their way to Sunday service. And I decided something else. This one took longer. Staring up at a water stain on the motel ceiling. I wasn't going to do it the old way. The old way was 6 years of tax money, laundered quietly through my brother's good name, love disguised as Marcus so it would be allowed through the front door. The old way kept everyone else comfortable, except me. So this time, I would buy my mother's debt, all of it, with the money I had bled 5 years to save, and this time, it would carry my name, my real name, the one already painted on the vans. I didn't yet know how she'd find out, or when, or what exactly it would cost me beyond the money itself. I only knew that the era of anonymous grace had died right there in that motel room. I slept for hours and woke up strangely, unexpectedly light. Wednesday morning, 13 days before the auction, Michelle called First Millbrook Savings and asked for whoever handled distressed assets, which, at a bank that size, turns out to be one tired man named Frank with a nameplate and a golf calendar tacked to his wall. Michelle never mentioned my mother's name, and she didn't need to. She said she represented a private holding company interested in taking a non-performing residential note off their books before the 17th. Cash, as no contingencies. You could practically hear Frank straighten up in his chair through the phone line. Small banks hate foreclosures, the legal fees pile up, the house sells soft at auction, the paperwork drags on into the next fiscal quarter, and examiners start circling the file like crows. A cash buyer for the note is basically Christmas morning in October. We ran it through W&D Holdings LLC, a company Michelle had set up 2 years earlier just to hold our garage bay and equipment yard. Boring on purpose. Paperwork with a locked door and nothing interesting behind it. By Thursday afternoon, Frank had come back with a payoff figure, $158,000, covering the balance, the accrued interest, and their legal costs to date. Sign within 48 hours, and they'd sign over the mortgage, hand over the note, and file to cancel the sheriff's sale. Michelle walked me through the stack of documents like a surgeon narrating her own procedure. Note, purchase agreement, assignment of mortgage, a lunge, cancellation filing, dry words on paper that all meant one very wet, very real thing. Whoever signed the bottom line would own the debt on 214 Maple Street with the full legal power to forgive it, restructure it, or burn the whole thing straight down. You understand what you're trading here, Michelle said. It wasn't really phrased as a question. The Harwell seller wanted my final answer by Friday, to the same 48-hour window, 2 doors, 1 key, and the key was every single dollar I had in the world. Send the papers, I told her. Friday morning, I sat in my truck outside the Millbrook branch and made 2 phone calls. In an order I chose very deliberately, because I knew, with total certainty, that if I made them in the other order, I might never make the second call at all. The first call was to the Harwell broker. I withdrew my letter of intent. He was decent about it, genuinely said the building had already waited 80 years. It could wait a little longer for me. We both understood that was a kindness, not a market analysis. 11,000 square feet of my father's name, and I let it slip through my fingers on a Friday morning in a bank parking lot, watching a man inside water a ficus through the window like nothing in the world was happening. Then I called Michelle and said, "Wire it $158,000 to First Millbrook Savings, which took my Harwell fund down to the studs. Plus another $9,000 out of my personal emergency account to cover the filing costs and Michelle's fees." Because irony apparently keeps its own punch clock. At 11:42 that morning, my phone buzzed once. Wire confirmed. That was the entire ceremony. No music, a parking lot, a ficus, a text message. And on the other side of it, an entirely different world. W&D Holdings now owned the note and mortgage on 214 Maple Street. The sheriff's sale was canceled by filing that same afternoon. My mother's house was safe. My mother had absolutely no idea, and the trade school was gone, and there was no undoing a single part of any of it. An assignment of record is a public document, sitting right there in the county books for anyone who knows how to look. Anonymous Grace was now a legal fiction with a paper trail attached to her name. I sat in that truck for a long while afterward. I'd like to tell you it felt noble. Mostly, it felt like giving blood. Necessary. Draining. Quieter than you'd expect it to feel. 3 days later, a letter with my company's name on it landed in my mother's mailbox. The cost of what I'd done didn't hit me at the bank. Costs never hit you at the register. They hit you later, in the aisles, when you see the exact thing you had to put back on the shelf. Saturday, I drove home to Columbus to check on the shop and swap out some gear, and I made the mistake of taking Parsons Avenue on the way. The Harwell building stood there, with its big dead windows and the ghost sign for a department store that had closed before I was even born, and the broker's lockbox still hanging on the front door. I pulled over. I had walked that floor 11 times over 6 months. I knew exactly where the benches would have gone, where I'd have hung the panel boards. 16 stations, a classroom up in the old mezzanine with my father's name in blue letters over the stairs. Some other buyer would get it now. A storage company, probably. Or somebody with better luck than mine. Jake, my foreman, caught me standing in the yard that afternoon and asked when we'd be signing on the school, because half my crew had already volunteered to teach evening classes there. Jake had apprenticed under me himself. He's got a kid and a mortgage now, because a stranger once took a chance on his hands the way somebody had never quite taken a chance on mine. I looked at him and heard myself say, "Not this year." He didn't push. Good foreman Reed faces the way I read blueprints. But he stood there an extra second, and something in me wanted, badly, to explain to tell him I hadn't lost my nerve. That the money wasn't gone. It was just wearing a different address now. I didn't say any of it. Old habits keep their own counsel. That night I ate dinner standing up at my kitchen counter, 33 years old, richer than my entire family tree combined, and owning, once again, approximately nothing. And I laughed once, out loud, at the sheer shape of it. Then I got back in my truck and drove toward Millbrook. Because there was still a party coming, whether I was ready for it or not. Here's the part I didn't witness myself. The part I had to piece back together afterward from Marcus and from Diane. The way you reconstruct a power outage from the scorch marks left behind. Monday, 5 days before the party, my mother opened her mailbox and found a letter from W&D Holdings, LLC. Formal notice. The note and mortgage on her property had been assigned to a new holder. The foreclosure sale scheduled for October 17th had been canceled, pending review of the account. There was a Columbus P.O. box listed, and Michelle's firm's number for any inquiries. To me, that letter had been an act of mercy in a windowed envelope. To my mother, it was a shark fin cutting through calm water. She called Marcus at the pharmacy twice before noon. Who is W&D? What do they want with my house, Marcus? Who could smell the shape of the answer from 30 miles away but wasn't fully certain of it yet? Told her, maybe it's good news, Ma. Cancelled is a good word. She would not hear it. Banks, she understood. Banks send you a calendar every Christmas. But a company, a nothing name made of initials, buying up her debt 3 days before her own auction. Nobody buys a stranger's trouble out of kindness, she told him. And you should sit with the fact, for just a moment, that my mother believed that sentence with her entire heart, because it explains absolutely everything you need to know about her, and about the house I grew up inside of. She spent that whole week polishing silverware for 40 guests, fully convinced a faceless company was circling her kingdom like a vulture. She was half right. It had a face, She'd simply spent 5 years introducing that face to people as a waitress. Marcus is not a stupid man. Wednesday night, he sat down at the county recorder's website. Because assignments of mortgage are a matter of public record if you know exactly where to click, and pharmacists are professionally excellent at reading fine print for a living. The assignment listed W&D Holdings, LLC. And below the notary block, a signature, Grace Whitman, member. He called me at 10 o'clock that night. I was sitting in the motel parking lot eating drive-thru out of the bag. W&D, he said. Whitman and daughter. You bought Mom's mortgage? There was nothing in his voice I could use to steer by. Flat? Like a hallway, yes, I said. Silenced long enough that I actually checked my screen to make sure the call hadn't dropped, then quieter than I'd heard my brother's voice since our father's funeral. With what grace that single word had to carry everything. The school money. There it is, he said, and laughed the way you laugh inside a hospital waiting room. Then the pharmacist in him took right back over, moving straight to the interaction warning. You have to tell her, Grace. If she finds out from the paperwork, or from some clerk's cousin, it'll be the funeral all over again. Except this time, she'll say you did it to humiliate her. You know she will. Tell her, or I will. And there it was. The last exit ramp off the old road, closing fast. 6 years of anonymity were finished, no matter what I chose to do next. I'll tell her after her birthday, I said. Let her have the party. She's already paid enough for it, Marcus exhaled slowly. 3 days, Grace. Everything in my family that October had a countdown clock bolted onto it somewhere. The night before the party, Diane dragged me back to the hall for final setup, and I got to watch my mother do a full dress rehearsal for an audience of empty folding chairs. She walked the room with a printed seating chart, adjusting place cards a precise quarter-inch at a time. Head table, Marcus, his wife, the kids, the pastor and his wife, seated to her right. Barbara Pruitt positioned close enough to see everything and far enough away to feel properly honored. I found my own name at table 6, tucked into the corner by the kitchen door, wedged between a Grittunkle's hearing aid and the coffee station. Table 6 is where you seat the caterer's cousin. I stood there holding my own little printed name card in her cursive handwriting, and I'll be honest with you, I almost drove home right then. 90 minutes, door locked, phone off. Let October 17th be a thing that quietly never happened, and let her wonder forever what it had meant. Instead, I walked out to my truck and opened my toolbox for no reason I could fully explain to myself. Top tray, where it always rides. My father's old multimeter, yellow case, gone soft and rounded at the corners. His initials scratched into the back with a tip of an awl. WWI. Put it in my jacket pocket like a saint's medal. Then I reached into the console and took out a single business card. Grace Whitman, owner, master electrician, Whitman and Daughter Electric, Columbus, Ohio. I slid it into the same pocket, right beside the multimeat, not a trophy. I want that understood clearly. A key, some doors, you knock on politely, some, you rewire. The hall genuinely looked beautiful that night, and I say that as the person who had fixed its floodlights herself and knew exactly what its wiring looked like underneath the makeup. Gold tablecloths, hydrangeas from somebody's own garden, dressed up to look like a florist's arrangement. 40 guests in their best church clothes, cousins in from Toledo. The entire rebuild committee, Pastor Collins, Barbara Pruitt in a blazer the color of a fire engine, positioned dead center like a satellite dish scanning the room. And my mother, I'll give her this much, forever. 60 looked good on her. Navy dress, pearl earrings, hair set that morning at the salon. She moved through that room like a woman with absolutely no unopened mail anywhere on earth. Laughing at exactly the right volume. Touching elbows at exactly the right moments. Being Eleanor Whitman harder than I had ever once seen her be Eleanor Whitman in my entire life. Only twice did I catch the current running underneath it all. Once, when the pastor casually asked after the house, and her smile held on a half-second too long, and once, when she glanced toward the door, every single time it opened. Like she was half expecting a process server to walk in wearing a bow tie. She was 60 years old and quietly terrified in pearls, and I was standing by the coffee station with her debt folded up in my jacket pocket. The monster she didn't know was already living under her bed. Diane swung by table 6 with 2 plates and parked herself next to me without being invited, which is Diane's own particular way of saying, "I love you, always do," I told her. She snorted straight into her sweet tea. Up at the head table, Marcus tapped his fork against his glass, and the whole room began to turn toward the sound. After the toasts finished, my mother did the thing she does at every single family gathering, the thing I had been seated through for 5 straight years running, the tours of accomplishments. She stood there with her glass of white wine and went around that room, introducing her own family to itself. Because, in her particular kingdom, saying a thing out loud, in public, is what finally makes it true. My son, Marcus, doctor of pharmacy. Marcus raised a hand while the room applauded him for simply existing. His wife, the school board seat. The grandchildren gifted, both of them, obviously. The cousins had their promotions read off like scripture verses. It went on like that, warm and well-rehearsed, and I watched her sail toward my table along the edge of the room, the way you watch weather rolling in across an open field. When she finally reached table 6, she looked directly at me. Really looked, the first full, unguarded eye contact of the entire night. And I watched something move behind her face. A half-second flicker. I know now, looking back, exactly what was living inside that half-second. A letter with 2 initials on it. An auction date. A fear she could not possibly say out loud in front of her own pastor. Whatever it actually was. She reached for the oldest tool sitting on her belt. She raised her glass a single degree and said, in precisely the voice you'd use for "It's a shame about the rain," something dismissive about her waitress daughter, who was still, bless her heart, figuring things out. Somebody's husband chuckled before he could stop himself. Barbara Pruitt's eyebrows performed a small, satisfied little ceremony all their own. 40 faces did the polite thing, which is to say, nothing at all, which is somehow worse than anything they could have said out loud. The coffee machine gurgled quietly behind me. Under the table, Diane's hand closed around my forearm, a warning or a mercy. To this day, I still don't know which. I felt the old familiar heat start climbing up the back of my neck. 5 straight years of it. And then, I swear to you, it simply stopped. Like a breaker doing the one job it was ever built to do. I smiled at my mother. I reached into my jacket. I stood up. Not fast. Not theatrical. I stood up the exact way you stand when it's finally your stop. The room did that thing rooms do when someone moves at the wrong beat in the music. Everything went a little quiet, without quite deciding to. I walked the length of 2 tables to where my mother stood, glass still raised, and I could feel Barbara Pruitt tracking me the whole way like sonar. My mother's chin lifted, already braced for a scene, already half hoping against one, already privately drafting how she'd describe it to the book club by Tuesday. I didn't make a scene. "Happy birthday, Mom," I said. And I took the business card out of my jacket pocket and placed it, gently, in her free hand. That's all. White card, blue ink, raised letters. Grace Whitman, owner, master electrician, Whitman and Daughter, Electric, Columbus, Ohio. I watched her eyes travel down to it. I watched her read it once and not understand it. The way you read a sentence in a language you studied a long time ago and never fully finished learning. And then I watched it land on her, in stages, like dominoes tipping over in slow motion. Whitman and Daughter Electric. The exact blue letters she had walked past for 3 months straight at the church rebuild. The professional outfit she'd bragged about to her own book club without ever once looking twice. W&D Holdings LLC. the letter sitting in her kitchen drawer. The cancelled auction, her eyes came back up to my face, and I watched 60 years of certainty try to reorganize itself around a single business card and fail, and try again. Her lips parted. No sound came out at all, and then her wine glass slipped straight out of her hand and burst against the hardwood floor like a small, bright bell, and 40 guests turned toward the sound all at once, and my mother stood in the wreckage of her own toast, holding my name in her open handi, leaned in close, so that only she could hear me over the room. "We should talk in the kitchen, Mom." The hall kitchen was all steel counters and borrowed quiet. Caterers' trays steaming faintly under foil. The door swinging shut behind us on 40 conversations restarting all at once out in the hall. Diane's voice rose cheerfully out there about the cake. God bless her, covering our exit like artillery fire. My mother stood with her back pressed against the prep table, holding my business card in both hands now, and she came apart in layers, in order. The way insulation strips back off old wire. First, the denial. This is Marcus's doing. This is some kind of, you do not own an electrical company, Grace. You wait tables. Not even cruel, automatic. A catechism she'd recited so many times it ran without her permission now. I said nothing, and my nothing answered her better than any words could have than the fear. Her voice dropping to a hiss, her eyes flicking toward the door. The letter, W&D, is that you? Is it you that bought? She couldn't quite make herself say the word mortgage. She just gestured at the card, a small tight circle in the air. My house. Yes, I said. It's me. It's been me for a while, Mom. In a lot of ways you don't know about yet. And then came the layer that told me everything. The one buried underneath every other layer. Her chin started to shake. She pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth. You came here to watch me lose it, she said. In front of Barbara. In front of the pastor. You waited 5 years to. She stopped herself cold, and what fell out of her neck didn't even sound like her own voice anymore. It sounded borrowed, older, flatter, a dorm room voice from 1988. They take everything from you eventually. That's what she always said. The only thing they can't take is the. She caught herself right on the word diploma, the way a woman catches herself on a stair rail at the very last second. I stood there, still as a wall, and let the silence hold her up. I took the folded papers out of my inside pocket and laid them down on the steel counter, one at a time, in the exact order Michelle had clipped them. The filing that canceled the sheriff's sale, stamped by the county clerk, and a lease. 214 Maple Street, tenant. Eleanor Whitman. Term, life. Rent, $1 per year. Nobody is taking your house, Mom. I bought the debt. All of it. It's already done. Done last Friday, before you'd even hung a single streamer for this party sheet. Looked at those papers the way a drowning woman looks at a rope she's absolutely certain is actually a snake. Out there tonight. Nothing happens, I told her, keeping my voice level because one of us had to be. No announcement. No scene. Barbara Pruitt goes home bored. As far as this whole town knows, the bank simply made an arrangement, and Eleanor Whitman is fine. You'll be the widow who managed forever. I laid my hand flat on the papers because she'd reached for them. It cost me the school, Mom. There was going to be a school, with Dad's name over the door, and I emptied every dollar of it into this house instead. So you will never owe me a single cent for this. And I promise you, you will never hear about it from me. Aguigne paused. But you owe me one sentence. She went completely still. Look at me. Not at the door, at me. And say it out loud. My daughter builds things. She didn't finish college. She didn't need to. She looked at the swinging door. Then back at me. For a long, long time. She tried it twice before it finally came out. The first attempt died somewhere around my daughter, her voice cracking straight down the middle like old lathe splitting. The second attempt got as far as builds and drowned right there. And then my mother, 60 years old, that exact day, pearls trembling faintly at her throat, my business card still folded in her fist, looked me directly in the eye and said it. All of it. Slowly, like a woman walking carefully out onto ice she isn't sure will hold her weight. My daughter builds things. She didn't finish college. A breath. She didn't need to. The last part came out barely above a whisper, and her face flinched around the words as they passed through her, as though the sentence itself had edges. I suppose, by then, it did. It had spent half a lifetime being filed down to a sharp point somewhere deep inside her, aimed the whole time in exactly the opposite direction. I won't dress this up for you, because that's not what this story deserves. She didn't fall into my arms. There was no swelling music. She wiped under one eye with a knuckle, straightened her back, and did something so perfectly, completely her, that I nearly laughed with an ache buried inside it. She smoothed the lease flat on the counter, squaring its corners, making even her own surrender look presentable. Dent. Tell them tonight, she said. Let me tell it my way. That's the difference between us, Mom, I said. And there was no blade hidden in it anymore, just the plain, simple fact of it, finally spoken out loud. I never needed them to know. By the 1st of December, here is the honest accounting, because I promised you honest numbers from the start. The lease is signed and recorded at the county. My mother lives at 214 Maple Street for the rest of her life, at $1 a year. The first thing I did as her landlord was send a crew to fix the downspout, the garage roof, and every single corner-cut circuit hiding in that house. The invoice went to the owner, which is to say, to me. The town found out anyway. Of course, county records are public, and Barbara Pruitt's nephew works at the title office, and Millbrook's radio station has never once, in its entire history, missed a broadcast. But here is the thing my mother never once saw coming, the thing I had suspected but couldn't have promised her. The story played backward from the one she had feared her entire life. The church ladies weren't scandalized. They were floored. The widow's waitress daughter turned out to own the very company that had rewired their church, and had quietly caught her own mother's house before it hit the ground. At Thanksgiving, I sat at the main table. Nobody said a single word about it, least of all me. My mother introduced me to a visiting cousin as my daughter, the electrician. Then, quieter, she owns the company. Then, unable to fully help herself, added that I could still finish my degree online someday, for the resume. I let it go by, the way you let weather go by. My grandmother's sentence doesn't die in 1 October. It just doesn't get to collect rent for me anymore. My father used to say, load-bearing walls don't ask to be noticed, and he was right about that. But I'd add one thing to it now. From the far side of that October, the day I finally stopped hiding inside my own drywall was the day the whole house finally stood up straight.